In the small, unremarkable town of Eldridge, where houses stood like weary sentinels, there lay a modest two-bedroom home on the edge of a shadowy cul-de-sac. Its once bright blue paint was now dulled, peeling in patches like the skin of an old wound. The yard was small but loved, where wildflowers competed for space with shy patches of grass. Inside this home lived a young woman named Clara, who had taken a big step toward adulthood by moving away from her parents' warm embrace. She felt proud of her independence, but it came with challenges she hadn't expected. On a particularly grim evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned a deep shade of gray, and a storm brewed in the distance. Clara felt an eerie chill wrap around her like a shroud. The wind rustled the leaves outside, and the air became heavy, pressing in on her and filling her with a sense of dread that clung to her bones like a thick fog. It was as if the very walls of her home were closing in, reminding her of the loneliness that sometimes whispered in the corners of her mind. As she settled down to enjoy a simple dinner of pasta, twirls of spaghetti glistening in the dim light, Clara felt a sudden chill sweep through the room. The lights gleamed sickly, flickering like fireflies caught in a trap. Frowning, she glanced at the overhead lamp, its warm glow sputtering as if it, too, were haunted by something elusive. "Just a bulb," she muttered, trying to convince herself everything was all right. She dismissed the unsettling feeling creeping up her arms, shaking her head as if to clear away the fog of worry. But deep down, a seed of fear took root, the kind of dread that buried itself deep within, growing stronger as it fed on her unease. Clara's evening took on an unsettling rhythm. After dinner, while she retrieved a worn book from the shelf, a beloved story about a brave knight and his adventures, she noticed that her favorite coffee mug had mysteriously appeared on the table. She was certain she had put it in the cupboard after washing it. Confusion rippled through her. "I must have misplaced it," she murmured softly, shaking her head at her own absent-mindedness. Settling into her favorite armchair, the one with faded fabric and a cozy indentation shaped like her body, Clara reached for the warm mug as a comforting piece of normalcy. But when she grabbed it, to her horror, it was empty, not a single drop of the rich brew she thought she had just enjoyed. The mug felt cold in her hands, and the realization sent a shiver racing down her spine. The sensation of being watched pressed at Clara's back as she lost herself in the pages of the book. The shadows around the room stretched and yawned dramatically, their shapes morphing just out of the corner of her eye. Words on the page began to blur like watercolor painting run by rain. Then, it began. A soft, guttural whisper echoed in her ear, chilling her to the bone. It felt as if the very darkness surrounding her was alive, encroaching slowly, wrapping around her like a thick blanket. The house was unnaturally silent. There were no creaking floorboards or rustling from the outside. Silence enveloped her, making the soft whisper stand out even more, as if it were the only sound in the world. "Forget," it echoed, a repetitive phrase that gnawed at her reality. It felt so close, like a hand brushing against her skin, chilling her even more. "Who's there?" she called out, her heart pounding like a wild drum in her chest. Silence greeted her in return. She felt absurd for talking to the empty air but could not shake the frigid feeling that settled deep within her bones, reminding her that something was very wrong. Glancing back to the dim light, shadows danced whimsically around the corners of her living room, twisting into grotesque shapes that flickered just beyond her vision. She instinctively clutched the mug tighter, though it offered no solace. It was as if the darkness was alive, watching her, waiting for her to slip further into despair. That night, troubled by the eerie events, Clara lay in bed, drawing the covers tightly around herself. The fabric felt coarse against her skin, and no matter how she positioned herself, she couldn't find warmth. She closed her eyes, attempting to block out the sounds, the whispers, the restless shadows, and the chilling air that haunted her in the darkness. But the whisperings did not leave her. They lingered in her mind, ominous and relentless. Sleep hovered just beyond her reach, feeding on her growing fears. Little did she know, the malevolent spirit had begun its merciless work, feasting on the very essence of her memories, like a sneaky thief stealing one precious thing after another, leaving her feeling hollow inside. The following morning dawned gray and dim, a heavy blanket of clouds refusing to relinquish the sun. As Clara prepared breakfast, she felt an odd tightness in her chest, an unsettling anxiety that made her stomach twist. She found herself misplacing items. First, the salt shaker, then the knife she had used to slice through a loaf of bread. The once familiar kitchen felt foreign, almost surreal. Each lapse of memory etched deeper lines of worry on her forehead, and with every forgotten item, her heart felt heavier. She stood frozen for a moment at the counter, her head swimming with thoughts. Looking out the window, she watched the sunlight bleed away behind the clouds, but it offered her nothing in return. It seemed her mind was already playing tricks, and perhaps it would be better to push through the disquiet and ignore the growing sense of anxiety that swelled in her chest. Making her way through the day, Clara decided to visit her friend Sarah. She hoped that the familiar company would lift her spirits and bring some relief to the fog of confusion that sat over her like a storm cloud. Upon arrival at Sarah's home, Clara could hear the laughter of her friend's children mingling with the warmth of mundane chatter. It felt like stepping into a world filled with joy and light, one that was so starkly different from the shadows that clung to her own life. But even as she joined in the lighthearted banter, the gnawing sense of forgetfulness tightened its grip on her. Clara caught herself losing track of conversations, her words floating away from her as if they had been snatched by the unforgiving wind. It was as if the world around her were a river, and she was a fragile leaf, carried away from the comforting shore and into chaos. "Are you okay, Clara?" Sarah's voice sliced through her fog. "You seem a bit out of it today." Clara wanted to reply, but what could she say? That she was haunted by shadows and persistent whispers? That she felt herself unraveling, thread by thread? "I'm just a little tired," Clara managed to say, forcing cheeriness to the surface, trying to hide the anxiety that danced around her heart. From somewhere deep inside, she felt a creeping chill crawl up her spine, as if the shadows outside were reaching in to claim her words. As the visit drew to a close, Clara searched for her bag in the usual places, but it was nowhere to be found. Panic flickered in her chest as she began to rummage through Sarah's living room, desperately searching high and low, but it eluded her. Just as frustration bubbled to the surface, Clara's heart dropped, and her mind raced. Did I even bring it? Her memory flickered, as if a light had gone out. Would she have forgotten something so important? What if it was left behind, like a forgotten toy left in the playground? The idea made her heart pound harder. Fear kissed her consciousness as her mind flitted back to moments she couldn't quite grasp. Had it been there? Did she simply not remember packing it? The questions tumbled, each one cultivating seeds of confusion, breeding distrust in her own thoughts. Clara fought against the whirlwind in her mind, feeling increasingly lost. It was a sensation she hadn't felt since being a child and losing her favorite blankie at the park, feeling adrift and alone. In the days ahead, Clara began experiencing even more profound lapses of memory. She stumbled through her routine like a ship lost at sea, forgetting keys at the door, leaving lights on long after she had left the room, and losing small conversations that had once been so crystal clear in her mind. Panic blossomed in her chest like a flower made of shadows, blooming in the darkness. It felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet, leaving her unsure of where she stood. It was another cloudy evening when she opened her front door, an eerie sense of déjà vu dancing at the edges of her mind. She stepped inside, her heart thumping in a rhythmic cadence against her ribcage, and she confidently thought to herself, "I left something inside." Yet, as she stepped over the threshold, the awareness slipped away, like trying to catch sand through her fingers, leaving only a sense of dread behind. Most terrifyingly, she could feel the entity entwined with her life, lurking like a shadow in every corner of her home, its whispers growing louder and more invasive. "Forget," it taunted, a chilling presence that breathed hope and memories away, draining her vibrant rays of thoughts and experiences. Each night, Clara barricaded herself in her bed, wishing for the dawn to arrive while clinging to thoughts of her past. But with each passing day, the shadow grew darker, more monstrous, feeding voraciously on her fading sanity. It was a cycle of worry. Clara felt like she was losing pieces of herself, like leaves blown away in the autumn wind, whispered away with no chance of grasping them again. She could feel the weight of despair slowly creeping in, pressuring her heart with a suffocating grip. And all the while, the whispers echoed through the halls of her mind, hauntingly repeating what she felt unable to remember. Forget. Clara didn't know how much longer she could endure the relentless assault on her thoughts, but one thing was certain. She needed to uncover the truth of what haunted her home and claimed her memories before it swallowed her whole. With that determination, she resolved to dig deeper into the mystery that surrounded her two-bedroom home on the edge of that shadowy cul-de-sac. Clara knew that facing the darkness was the only way to wrest back control of her life from the sinister whispers that threatened to erase her whole being. Weeks blended into a nightmarish dreamscape where Clara roamed semi-consciously, every day bleeding into the next. She found herself wandering at odd hours of the night, unintentionally becoming a ghost in her own home, simply staring at the walls she had known for years. The wallpaper, with its faded rose patterns, felt like a long-standing relic of her former self, yet now it brought her no comfort. Instead, it reminded her only of her deepening isolation, a chill creeping into her heart as she desperately searched for warmth and familiarity but only found an unsettling familiarity. The once comforting walls seemed to whisper secrets that pricked her nerves and left her feeling more disconnected from herself than ever. The whispering voice had become louder in the silence, wrapping around her like a suffocating woolen blanket, making her feel heavily weighed down as if the air itself was thicker than the fog outside. It left her gasping for clarity, for the vibrancy of her once sparkling self. Shadows flitted across her thoughts, taunting her desperation, as though they were mocking her struggles or, worse, inviting her to join them in their darkness. One particularly dreary night, tormented by the constant whispers she believed were coming from the very walls around her, Clara decided to confront the dark presence that had settled into her home. It was her empty, cloistered flat, a once vibrant place filled with laughter and warmth, where the happy memories now felt like distant echoes. The laughter had faded, and the coziness had been replaced by an unshakable gloom that she could bear no longer. Staring into the inky blackness that engulfed her like an all-consuming void, she mustered her strength and called out into the air, "What do you want from me?" Her voice trembled, revealing a stark vulnerability that echoed futilely into the chilling silence, swallowed and absorbed by the darkness surrounding her. The shadows answered no one, their silence deafening. Instead, they wriggled and danced, moving in grotesque performances against the walls, like an eerie puppet show mocking her bravery, yet no semblance of clarity ever emerged from the chaos in her mind. Days turned into a haze, as if the sun never truly shone above Eldridge, a place where the storms seemed to roll in and settle indefinitely, much like Clara's own turmoil. Clara's work began to suffer. She missed important meetings, misplaced critical documents, and stumbled over even the simplest tasks she had once handled effortlessly. The once focused woman dissipated, replaced by a hollow shell, each forgetful episode turning her heart colder and darker with dread. At times, she would catch a glimpse in the mirror and not recognize the haunted reflection staring back. There was a monstrous presence lurking just beneath the surface, whispering its seductive promises of relief if only she embraced the shadows, if only she let them consume her fully. Clara's home soon filled with items that were never hers, discarded keys, unfamiliar books with crumbling pages, and even photos of strangers lingering in frames that seemed to construct a wall of lives she had never lived. Each new addition stirred disquiet within her, yet she could no longer summon the strength to confront the mounting evidence that her reality was warping around her. She learned to live with the inappropriate, disturbing souvenirs, as they seemed to affirm the spirit's presence, proof that something malevolent thrived on her slips of consciousness. She grew accustomed to the eerie hauntings, both reluctant to admit her weakness and increasingly numb to the twisted truths unraveling around her. Her once cozy home had transformed into a mausoleum of memories lost, a place where joy had once flourished but now loomed as an apparition of what could have been. Desperate for help and hungry for answers, she turned to the local library, a musty building filled with ancient tomes and forgotten knowledge. Sunlight filtered dimly through the dusty windows, casting a soft glow over the shelves, but Clara felt no warmth there. She buried herself in research, sifting through old books filled with tales of hauntings, curses, and those brave souls who had confronted spirits far darker than her own. She hoped to find guidance deep within the pages, a way to cleanse her home of the growing shadows. Hours passed as she pored over haunted histories, her fingers brushing the spines of titles that seemed to whisper their own secrets to her. But with each effort to uncover the truth, moments slipped through her fingers like smoke, evading her grasp. As soon as she thought she understood, the words blurred together, turning into an indecipherable riddle that fed into her confused psyche. "Forget," the voice seemed to hiss from the shadows, demanding her attention while simultaneously transmuting knowledge into shadows. Answers eluded her grasp, mocking her efforts and leaving her with a sense of helplessness. Returning home that night, Clara stumbled over her own feet, mind racing with the weight of her discoveries, desperation clawing at her throat like a tightening noose. She knew she must confront this spirit, She must end the darkness that had clawed its way into her life. But how? The brief flickers of determination were overshadowed by the now familiar vertigo of confusion and doubt that plagued her. She felt the whispers swirl around her like a tempest, their hideous laughter rising in a mocking chorus that relished in her torment. It fueled the darkness, deepening the sense of malice that loomed just beyond her sight. She felt like a piece of forgotten history, slowly unraveling without a trace, each unraveling thread drawing her closer to despair. Sleep no longer held comfort for her. Instead, it became a battleground. She would wake drenched in sweat, her heart racing wildly in her chest, thumping like a war drum. At times, she thought she saw distorted figures flickering at the threshold of her dreams, their grotesque faces bending in agony, their skeletal fingers reaching for her, desperate and hungry, as if they craved something from her that she could not give. She felt their wretched hunger for memories, dark and insatiable, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Each night bled into the day, robbed of any semblance of rest, until exhaustion pinned her to the ground, making her feel utterly helpless against the encroaching shadows that had become so familiar yet so terrifying. As Clara's mind spiraled deeper into chaos, the whispers intensified, rising to a fevered pitch, now growing sharper, morphing into sinister chants that echoed within the confines of her mind. Friends began to notice her obvious decline, their concern growing palpable. Sarah approached her gently one evening, concern etched upon her features as she studied Clara's drawn face. "Are you okay, Clara?" she asked softly, her tone laced with worry. "You look lost." But strengthened by her fear, Clara pushed the world away. "I'll be fine," she lied, her voice quaking with the weight of her deceit. The words felt hollow, but the truth was far too heavy to share. Within these empty walls, Clara wrestled with her sanity, crumbling further into the abyss, hoping the faint tenderness of friendship would pierce through the monstrous disarray festering inside her. Driven to the brink of her capacity to endure, Clara devised a desperate plan. She would draw a protective sigil around her home, a crude attempt to seal the spirit away once and for all. It would be her last stand against the curse gnawing at her existence, a fight against the malevolence that sought to claim her. The following morning, Clara gathered her supplies. She found a bottle of indelible ink and a worn-out brush buried in her art supplies, remnants of happier days. Armed with this makeshift tool, she scrawled frantically across the floors and walls, tracing jagged lines meant to repel darkness. She chanted quietly under her breath, feeling bolder with each stroke, hoping that this would somehow harness a power within her. But as she worked, the air around her crackled with an ominous energy, a sinister presence sensing her challenge lurking just beyond her awareness. The shadows twisted and writhed with grotesque menace as the whispers intensified, covertly mocking her efforts, relishing in her fear. And then it happened. A sudden jolt made her freeze in place. A cold gust of wind blasted through her home, snuffing out the flickering candles and leaving her in darkness once again. Panic rose in her throat, choking her as the whispers crescendoed, rising to an almost deafening clamor. For the first time, Clara felt a palpable force spiraling around her, coiling like a serpent, squeezing the breath from her lungs. It struck her with terrifying clarity. She was no longer in control. The realization spiraled into her consciousness like a point of no return. Time was running out, and she was left clinging desperately to the ghost of a memory, one that threatened to evaporate completely like morning mist under the heat of the sun. In that moment of suffocating dread, a sense of icy determination flickered within Clara, urging her to push through the overwhelming despair. The shadows were closing in, but so was her resolve. Even if this was a last attempt, it could not be in vain. She would no longer be a passive figure in this haunting, she would take back control. With a fierce intensity, Clara steadied her brush and resumed her frantic scrawling, desperate to finish her protective sigil before the encroaching darkness could swallow her whole. "Please, let me find you," she whispered into the churning void, hoping, praying even, that her words would hold some weight, that the act of speaking might summon something stronger than the whispers. As she emphasized the final stroke, the air crackled again, and an eerie silence enveloped her room, a tension building that wrapped around her like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. Clara stood still, heart thundering and breath shallow, waiting for a response that both terrified and thrilled her. What would come next? She dared not ponder too long, wrestling against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her spirit. The shadows continued to loom, hovering at the edges of her sight, swirling like smoke that could just as easily slip through her fingers. Desperation etched across her thoughts, but in that desperate moment, flickering between fear and courage, Clara chose to believe that the power to reclaim her life lay within her reach. She imagined herself pulling that power from the depths of her heart, reaching for a glimmer of light amidst the shadows, for hope would not surrender easily, not if she fought for it. With conviction burning brighter than the whispers, Clara cried out into the darkness once again, "I won't let you take me." And as she spoke, it felt as though the energy around her twisted, rattling the very air she breathed, savoring her defiance and daring the shadows to respond. What would happen next? The danger of the unknown laid ahead of her, shrouded in darkness, but she stood firm, driven by a flicker of determination that swung between fear and the longing for liberation. In that oppressive silence, she took a deep breath, ready to face whatever emerged from the depths of despair. Something had to give, and she was willing to pay whatever price necessary to reclaim her narrative from the sinister grasp of the shadows. As days turned into weeks, Clara's life began to spiral increasingly into disarray. At first, the protective sigil she had drawn on the wall had seemed like a beacon of hope, a shield to guard her against the shadows that threatened to creep into her life. It was a sign that promised refuge and safety, yet now it twisted into a grotesque reminder of her futile attempts to reclaim her sanity. Instead of keeping the darkness at bay, it felt as though the sigil invited more shadows to come closer, allowing the whispers to seep deep into her very soul. They taunted her every moment, an eerie refrain that echoed in her mind, "Forget, fade away." These words were like chilling winter winds that drowned her in an unfathomable haze, making her feel as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which she could not awaken. The weight of despair pressed down on her like a heavy cloak, stifling any flickers of light that might have tried to break through. Each day felt like slipping further into a fog, where clarity was an impossible dream. Every evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness wrapped around her like a tight blanket, Clara retraced her steps in futile attempts to find remnants of her former life. She found herself wandering the halls of her home, searching for comfort in the familiar corners that held echoes of laughter and warmth. But to her dismay, everything that was once familiar seemed to dissolve into nothingness before her eyes, leaving her grasping at illusions that disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. Meals that were once prepared with joy and care had transformed into bland sustenance that barely registered on her taste buds. Every bite felt like a reminder of the vibrant flavors that had once brought her joy but now tasted like ash. She became increasingly isolated from her friends, their outlines fading into the distance like images in a mirage. Social interactions felt overwhelming, and each phone call was met with a deep-seated fear, the fear of sharing her fractured reality. Avoiding their calls became a survival tactic, a means to shield herself from the silent anguish that enveloped her. Clara wandered through the relics of her existence, collecting remnants of hopes that had slipped away like sand through her fingers. She scribbled notes hastily on scraps of paper, reminders of things never to be forgotten yet soon forgotten anyway. These hasty notes piled up around her, a chaotic testament to her disorganization. Some said, "Call Mom." Others read, "Don't forget to feed the plants." But far too often, she would look at these notes and realize she hadn't done any of the things she promised to do. Her job at the local library felt like a relentless trap, each day blurring into the next like brushstrokes of gray in a picture where color once thrived. Colleagues huddled together, whispering concerns about her well-being as she stumbled through tasks. It was as though they could see the shadows lurking behind her, the dark cloud that had settled over her head. Clara could feel the weight of their gazes, their eyes filled with concern and pity. Her boss looked at her with suspicion, as if she were a puzzle that confused him. His eyes flickered like a predator considering a skittish prey. Was she still Clara, or had the shadows consumed her entirely? She felt less than human, like a mere ghost haunting her own life, drifting through each day burdened by unshakable anxiety. It was an unbearable loop that fed into the shadows, pulling her deeper into despair. Each time she thought she could break free, a new wave of fear swept over her, leaving her paralyzed. It felt as if she were drowning in a never-ending ocean, gasping for breath yet finding only water filling her lungs. Then came the night when Clara found herself awake at an ungodly hour, the atmosphere heavy with an oppressive silence. The world outside her window lay cloaked in darkness, deep and still, as if hiding secrets that were never meant to be known. Startled by her own reflection in the glass, Clara stumbled back, realizing the visage staring back at her was pale and sunken, a grotesque mirror of her inner turmoil. Panic surged through her, igniting a desperate urgency within. In her desperation, Clara sought comfort from the supernatural tomes she had initially hesitated to read. She felt drawn to them, sensing they might hold the key to understanding the creeping darkness that surged through her life. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to dominate this insidious force instead of letting it consume her. Gathering her courage, she opened a dusty, old book, its pages yellowed with age. But as she delved into the arcane words, the moments began to warp beyond definition. She would sit there in silence, absorbed in the stories of otherworldly beings, only to look up and discover that entire hours had slipped away like water through her fingers. The clock ticked relentlessly, each echo punctuating the growing dread building within her chest. Time itself felt distorted, and Clara found herself unable to distinguish between reality and the dreams that haunted her each night. Nothing could stir her from that stillness, that insidious cold that draped around her like a funeral veil, trapping her memories deeper into silence. Suddenly, unsettling visions assaulted her. Haunted dreams morphed into waking nightmares, where Clara found herself wandering through foggy landscapes, calling out for someone she could not remember. The air felt thick and heavy, clinging to her skin like damp mist. She reached out, her fingers trembling, searching for familiar faces that danced just beyond her grasp. Their silhouettes flickered like candles in the wind, promising warmth but vanishing the moment she got close. The laughter of her childhood friends turned hollow, echoing like distant echoes of a long-lost tune. It was as if they were laughing at her, sadistic in their detachment, reminding her of the vibrant life she once led. Shadows crept from the edges of her vision, silently consuming joy and distorting clarity. The once vibrant memories of laughter and happiness twisted into visions of terror, clawing at her consciousness and stripping away the last vestiges of her identity. And then, it happened. One desolate evening, as the midnight hour crept ever closer, Clara stared into the mirror once more. What she saw shocked her to her core. It wasn't just her pallid reflection that horrified her, but the realization that she didn't know her own name. The thought crashed over her like a wave, a violent tempest of recognition and oblivion that shattered her perception. Shredded fragments of her identity floated like dust in a sunbeam, memories of laughter and love morphing into blank slates filled with the relentless whisper beckoning her deeper into the abyss. Forget, it purred with a chilling voice that slithered around her like a snake, wrapping icy fingers around her throat and commanding obedience to the pulling shadows. Clara collapsed to her knees, tears spilling silently down her cheeks, leaving trails of desperation. In all her quest to fight back, she had inadvertently unleashed something dark and demoniac, allowing her fragmented existence to intertwine with the insatiable hunger of the spirit. Pulsating shadows began to envelop her, a lingering smell of putrid decay hanging in the air like a rancid fog that filled her lungs with despair, leaving her gasping for breath. Dark fingers seemed to graze against her skin, reaching for her thoughts, pulling at the seams of her reality, devouring her stories, memories, and cherished moments that had once defined her life. In the depths of that despair, Clara grappled for one last shred of hope, but it flickered like a dying candle, faint, almost extinguished. The room around her pulsed with malevolent energy, shadows spinning wildly as the whispers crescendoed into a chaotic chorus. It felt impossible to differentiate where the darkness ended and she began. Endless fragments of herself began to swirl within, taunting her with sight and sound, a cacophony of her undoing. As the night wore on, Clara's existence began to fracture further, as if her essence was split into pieces, never to come whole again. The darkness conspired with the shadows crawling in every corner of her home, their laughter sneering at her miserable struggles. What remained of her identity now mingled grotesquely with the spirit's true form, forming an unnerving union of despair and terror, leaving her feeling trapped between two worlds. She was becoming more like the darkness itself, losing her grip on humanity altogether. Every fleeting moment of regret faded in the clutches of her defeated mind as she melted into a totality of forgetfulness and tragic acceptance. And so, as Clara knelt in the shadows, she felt a profound loneliness engulf her, cold and unforgiving. The once vibrant life she had known faded into a still photograph, a memory that whispered through the void of her own existence. She felt the chilling fingers of despair smoothing over her skin, tugging at her thoughts as the shadows promised release from the pain. But she knew deep inside that to give in would mean losing herself completely, plunging into a darkness so profound that she might never find her way back. With each breath, she battled against the darkness, clinging tightly to the flickering flame of hope that still burned somewhere within her. She had to remember who she was, to fight for her memories, for the life she had built. It was a task that seemed insurmountable, yet it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the world outside the shadows. A world where laughter could be real, and joy, something to be cherished once again. The time had come for Clara to make a choice. To break free from the shadows that sought to consume her, or to surrender to the void, losing everything she held dear. With the echoes of the past urging her forward, Clara lifted her head, determination blooming like a flower through the cracks of despair. She would not fade away. She would not forget. With that thought clinging to her heart, she gathered her strength, ready to face the darkness head on. The dawn broke over Eldridge, casting pale shafts of light through the worn curtains of Clara's home, a home that had once been filled with laughter, joy, and warmth. As the sun peeped through the fabric, it seemed to mock Clara's plight, shining down with happiness while she felt completely empty inside. The light was no longer a comfort to her. Instead, it felt like a harsh spotlight shining on the gaping holes left by the things she could no longer feel or remember. Clara found herself in a strange place, a place where shadows danced and whispered tauntingly around her, reminding her of the memories that were now out of reach, hidden deep within a darkened abyss. She could never tell if it was morning or afternoon anymore. Time seemed to twist and turn, slipping through her fingers like water. Days blurred together, merging into a strange, foggy haze that clouded her thoughts. Clara often knelt on the cold floor, cradling her head in her trembling hands, as heavy darkness crept closer, its icy fingers wrapping around her mind and heart. The malevolent spirit that had invaded her life felt like an unwelcome guest, but one she couldn't evict. It slithered inside her, stealing pieces of her being, leaving behind only an echo, a hollow shell of the girl she used to be. As the spirit pulled her deeper into its clutches, Clara was overwhelmed by a cold satisfaction that sneaked into her heart. There was something almost soothing about yielding to the darkness, though it felt like letting go of everything she had loved and known. She stopped fighting against it, allowing herself to sink into the abyss, seeking warmth in its unholy embrace. It was as if surrendering to the shadows offered her a sense of peace, a release from the constant ache of memories that should have been cherished but were now nothing more than fading specters. Each day, Clara rummaged through her home, searching desperately for fragments of her old life that would connect her to who she used to be. She searched through dusty boxes, flipping through old photographs and trinkets that had once brought her joy. But each picture she pulled out was a cruel reminder, twisted and altered. Images that should have depicted happy moments turned into distorted reflections of strangers laughing alongside her. The faces of friends and family contorted in a grotesque manner, their smiles taunting her, their names just out of reach like whispers carried off by the wind. Who were these people? How had they all become strangers to her? With each photograph, Clara felt her grip on reality loosening. It paralyzed her, letting despair seep into her veins. She stood at the edge of a dark chasm, staring into a void that seemed to mock her very existence. The shadows that had once terrified her had become familiar. They were the only constant in her life. They had transformed from phantoms into silent companions, wrapping around her like a shroud. They were there during her darkest moments, singing a haunting lullaby that lulled her into complacency. In that suffocating silence, Clara finally yielded to the shadows, giving in to the embrace of the unknown. The decision felt both frightening and freeing. As she allowed herself to slide into that all-consuming darkness, the whispers in her mind began to swell. Forget, they urged her, and with each repetition, the word twisted into something seductive, pulling her deeper into the chasm. The promise of relief from her pain, the allure of forgetting who she was, made the darkness seem almost inviting. As she descended into this shadowy abyss, mists of darkness began to swirl around her, coalescing into twisted figures that emerged from the black depths. They were grotesque forms, their bodies shaped like the remnants of her own fading consciousness. Clara could not decipher if they were real or merely manifestations of her fears. They moved closer, shrouded in an insatiable hunger. These shadows feasted on the memories that once made her whole. They devoured every joyous moment, every adventure, every simple pleasure, leaving nothing behind but emptiness. Her laughter morphed into cries of despair, with echoes resonating within the chaos of her mind, robbing her of understanding and clarity. In the depths of her turmoil, she found herself consumed by a terrible sense of déjà vu. Each moment was like a clumsy puppet show playing before her, filled with laughter, love, and life. But those fleeting glimpses transformed into distorted scenes, mirroring her painful existence. She saw flashes of joyous birthday parties, colorful balloons floating into the sky, and gifts wrapped in shiny paper, all twisted into grotesque parodies. These remained as tragic reminders of everything she had lost or could never recapture. Ultimately, Clara felt as though she had vanished, consumed by the vast, dark void that swallowed her whole. It engulfed her existence as if she had never been part of the living world at all. The shadows quietly conspired, sharing timeless secrets that only they understood, while her very essence faded away, leaving behind an empty shell, a mere echo of her former self. And yet, even in the depths of despair, Clara couldn't help but reminisce about the vibrant life she once lived. There were brief moments of clarity, where memories flickered like fireflies in the dark. She remembered running through fields of wildflowers, their vibrant colors painting the landscape with joy. She saw herself sitting under the wide, welcoming arms of her favorite oak tree, the leaves singing softly in the breeze as she read her favorite books, lost in fantastical worlds and faraway places above the clouds. The scent of baking cookies would waft through the air, drawing her to the kitchen where laughter and conversation combined like an enchanting melody. Those were the moments filled with sunlight, warmth, and love, but they were only fleeting flashes of a distant past, quickly snuffed out by the relentless darkness surrounding her. The shadows continued their feast, absorbing the remnants of who she had once been. They had consumed not only her memories but also her very spirit. The horrifying spirit that had taken root within her flourished, growing stronger as the last threads of her identity withered away. The echoes of her laughter now morphed into chilling cries, a symphony of sorrow and loss woven into an unending cycle. In the darkest corners of her mind, Clara still fought against the choking despair, seeking even a flicker of hope or a chance to reclaim herself. Thoughts of rediscovery flickered like a candle in the wind, but the candle's flame was dimming, threatening to be extinguished. She desperately clung to those thoughts, reaching out as if grasping for a lifeline. But the spirit tightened its grip, relishing in her struggle, dragging her further into obscurity. The house stood still, its silence echoing Clara's own desolation. Walls once filled with joy now stood witness to a tragedy that would only linger in shadows, forgotten by the world outside. The town of Eldridge continued to buzz with life. Children played in the streets under the watchful eyes of parents. Flowers bloomed with vibrant colors in gardens, and laughter filled the air, while Clara became a ghost in her own home. She was trapped in a realm where shadows held dominion, and her existence felt like a fading photograph left in the sun too long, growing dull and indistinct over time. As the hours turned into days and days into weeks, Clara drifted deeper into the shadowed realm of her own mind, lost in the ceaseless cycle of darkness. The spirit that had taken root within her continued to thrive. It fed on her despair and brought with it echoes of her past, horrific reminders of what had once been and what could never be again. The essence of who she was began to erode, twisted into a tale of dark sorrow that haunted her. And so, Clara became a forgotten echo, entwined in the depths of Eldridge, her existence now but a whisper carried on the wind, spoken only in hushed tones, murmurs of a girl who had been lost to shadows. The spirit that had devoured her memories thrived, feasting on her misfortune, growing stronger as the world outside moved onward, perpetually unaware of the girl slowly fading into nothingness. The girl who had once filled her home with laughter, love, and light.